All right, so just to bring up what I talked about last time, Japan had, in 1931, taken over Manchuria and turned it into the independent state of Manchukuo, which wasn't independent, it was actually a Japanese puppet state. And then in 1937, they had invaded China proper and had moved down the coast of China, taking everything down to Guangzhou, which is Canton.
Dang, that's a big swath of land.
It is. It is. So, at this point, 1937 to 39, Japan has basically been able to be an aggressor against China, take a bunch of territory from China, but they can't go any further because up until 1939, everything else they want in the Pacific is controlled by a European power, and Japan isn't sure they want to tangle with a European power yet. In particular, Indonesia is Dutch, okay, Vietnam was called French Indochina, which is Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos is French. Thailand is an independent country, and then Burma and Malaysia are British colonies. Okay? And then the United States has the Philippines as a colony, as well as Hawaii is part of the United States, or else it's a U.S. territory at that point. It's not a state yet. Any questions about that?
Was Midway a territory or just some random island at this point?
Midway was American territory. Midway, I believe, is technically part of Hawaii. It's in that island chain. It's at the very end of the island chain. You can sort of see, Hawaii stretches over. Any other questions? So,
Was Australia involved in the war in the Pacific?
yes, they were part of the British Commonwealth.
Yeah.
So at that point, I believe, I'd have to double check, but I believe the King of England was the King of Australia also, although they were technically separate countries. And Australia did declare war, and Australia did fight alongside the United States in all sorts of theaters in here. But there is no comparable Gallipoli about World War II. So Japan, up until 1939, realizes they want any more territory, they're going to have to take it from a European power. They don't want to get into a war with France. They don't want to get into a war with Britain. They don't want to even get into a war with the Dutch necessarily, because France and Britain would probably come to the Dutch's aid, and they don't want to get into a war with the United States. But 1939 changes things dramatically because suddenly the war starts, and Britain and France and Holland are very much occupied with what's going on in Europe. And then in 1940, Holland and France are conquered by the Germans. And in particular, Vichy France gets set up. And Japan realizes then, in 1940, that, France isn't really going to be able to defend anything right now, and probably Holland isn't either. And so Japan would take French Indochina between September and December of 1940. So they would invade this part of this French colony here in December, from September to December, after France falls in June. But at this point, the biggest obstacle to going any further, obviously they don't want to tangle with Britain. Britain's a major power. So Malaysia and Burma are going to have to wait. And they don't want to tangle with the United States and the Philippines yet because the United States is a major power. And so Japan makes an interesting calculation. They basically, this is probably a bad metaphor, but if you have a 150-pound guy who realizes he's going to get into a bar fight with a 200-pound, really muscular guy, his best option is probably not, let's wrestle until the strongest one wins, because the one guy is much stronger than the other one. His best option is, I'll say, hey, what's that? And then punch him when he's not looking and hope that he goes down for the count, right? And so Japan basically says the United States is a much bigger power than Japan. The population is bigger, the industrial base is bigger, they have a much bigger navy, etc. And so they don't want to get into a long, drawn-out war with the United States because they're afraid, essentially, that they will lose through attrition. The United States could trade one Japanese soldier for one American soldier and still come out way ahead at the end. They can trade one airplane for one airplane and win because they have more airplanes, they have more ships, etc. So Japan decides that their best option now, by let's say the end of 1940, England is definitely in the war, for the long run, because they've won the Battle of Britain, they're still in the war, but they're preoccupied with what's going on in Europe. So England may or may not have a major response if Japan tries anything in Southeast Asia. But the United States is not at war, and the United States has basically told Japan in no uncertain terms, and they've even put some embargoes on Japan, don't take any European territories, don't take any colonies, don't take anything. So basically Japan decides the United States is the major obstacle at this point. Britain is a minor obstacle, France and Holland are not obstacles at all. So Japan decides they're basically going to do a knockout blow to the United States with a surprise attack on Pearl Harbor. Pearl Harbor is the major U.S. naval base in Hawaii. The U.S. Navy at this point was split into two fleets. There's the Atlantic Fleet and the Pacific Fleet. And basically, it's not quite divided in half, but roughly in half. And so the American Atlantic Fleet is entirely preoccupied with shipping supplies to England and getting ready for World War II over there. Although the United States has no plans of getting into World War II in Europe yet. The Pacific Fleet, you've got a number of battleship groups, but the heart of the Pacific Fleet for the United States is 4 aircraft carriers. Now, aircraft carriers, for those of you who don't know, are these huge ships with a flat top, and you can take off and land airplanes on them. They're small airplanes. You cannot land big airplanes on an aircraft carrier. In fact, one of the first things the United States did right after it declares war against Japan is they take an aircraft carrier with B-26s, which are twin-engine bombers, which are pretty big, and they realized they could just barely launch them off of an aircraft carrier, but you couldn't land them on an aircraft carrier because the aircraft carrier is not big enough. But they launched a whole bunch of B-26s for the Doolittle raid, and they bombed Tokyo just as a sort of symbolic gesture. Hey, you want to mess with us? And then they went and crash landed in Japan or China because they couldn't get back to the aircraft carrier. They couldn't land on an aircraft carrier. They couldn't get back to the United States.
I believe they gave the pilots phonetic pronunciations of Chinese.
Oh, really?
Like, hey, I'm an American. I just bombed Japan.
Yeah.
Just tell me where to go. I need to get back.
Yeah.
Ronald?
So Japan basically decides if they can destroy, and the 4 aircraft carriers are crucial because when you are fighting in the Pacific, aircraft carriers are a way of projecting power because you can take dozens or hundreds of airplanes, not hundreds, but dozens of airplanes on an aircraft carrier, and you can bomb land targets, you can bomb other ships, etc. So it's a way of projecting enormous amounts of power, and without that, ships are pretty much sitting ducks for other airplanes without having air cover themselves because airplanes can sink ships way better than ships can sink airplanes. Nothing to sink airplanes, but So Japan decided that the key was that if they could destroy the 4 aircraft carriers in the U.S. Navy, then they would basically be able to take everything they wanted in the Pacific before the United States could rebuild its aircraft carriers. And without the aircraft carriers, the United States really couldn't project power across the Pacific. And so essentially they can destroy the 4 aircraft carriers, they can take whatever they want in the Pacific, and then the assumption is by the time the U.S. is ready to fight again, they've built new aircraft carriers and they've gotten, done a draft and built up the army. By that point, Japan will have solidified its control of everything it wants, and it can basically go to the United States and say, let's negotiate, and Japan will be in a position of strength, and they hope that they can negotiate it so the United States basically recognize all of Japan's conquests, right? So this is Japan's plan for winning, is we're going to do a surprise attack that cripples the U.S. Navy and then grab everything we want in a hurry and then hope that the United States is so preoccupied in Europe and takes so long to get ready to go that we can get a peace treaty to end the war before the United States brings its full power to bear on Japan. Everyone with me? Any questions on
This was the plan this was like the thought going into Pearl Harbor for them?
Exactly. So the Japanese had some intelligence on from Hawaii. They had spies in Hawaii, and they had carefully watched the U.S. fleet coming and going. They knew that the U.S. fleet was doing a bunch of exercises, training exercises, out in the Pacific in the last half of November, early December of 1941, but they were going to come back on December 6th and be in Pearl Harbor. The entire U.S. Pacific Fleet was going to be in Pearl Harbor, essentially. Not all of it, but the vast majority of it, and the 4 aircraft carriers. So the Japanese basically attacked Pearl Harbor on December 7th. It is a surprise attack, although there's all sorts of conspiracy theories that Franklin Delano Roosevelt almost certainly wanted the United States to get into the war in Europe to stop fascism because it really worried him, but he didn't think the American public was ready for it. So in one sense, the Pearl Harbor attack did what Roosevelt wanted, because after Pearl Harbor, the American public was ready to go to war, and if Germany declares war, great, then we'll go to war with Germany. And so some people have speculated, and there's little bits of hints of evidence that might indicate possibly that somebody in the U.S. intelligence community has some inkling that Japan was going to attack Pearl Harbor, but whatever the case, the U.S. did not prepare for it. However, and so they attack on the morning of December 7th. They send an aircraft carrier group from Japan. They launch a whole bunch of airplanes. They sink the Arizona and a number of battleships, a whole bunch of cruisers and destroyers. But what they discover is that the 4 aircraft carriers are not in Pearl Harbor. They were scheduled to be back with the rest of the fleet, but they weren't. They had decided to stay out and do some extra exercises for a few extra days, which is, of course, where the conspiracy theorists are like, why did they have, et cetera. The net result is that although Pearl Harbor was a crippling blow for the U.S. Navy because it lost several battleships and cruisers and destroyers, et cetera, and 2,400 American dead, it was not a crippling blow because the 4 aircraft carriers were not there and were not damaged. Listen.
The repair sites were also not severely damaged, right? Or were those also targets?
You mean the shipyards where they would?
Yeah.
I think they targeted them, but that's much harder to blow up than to sink a ship. I mean, the Japanese are coming off of aircraft carriers. They have fairly small bombers. So they don't have the types of, B-17 dropping 3,000 pounds of bombs at once. They don't have that kind of firepower here. So they're targeting the ships because they can sink ships with torpedo bombers and dive bombers, etc. Does everyone know what a torpedo bomber is? All right, so a dive bomber is basically a single engine airplane with 2 people in it, and it carries one 500-pound bomb. And they come in at 30,000 feet and they dive, and then they let the bomb go and it goes right where they were diving at, and then they pull out and the bomb goes exactly where it was aimed for. Torpedo bombers are basically the same airplane. In fact, in the Japanese Navy, they are the same airplane. You just put a torpedo under it, a single torpedo, and they fly in at about 20 feet above the water, and they aim at a ship and drop the torpedo, and the torpedo goes at the ship. And so torpedo bombers have to come in very low on the water because they're dropping the torpedoes into the water, and it has to be a seamless launch.
Did Japan not have submarines?
They did.
Okay.
Oh yeah, they absolutely did. But the torpedo bombers you can send them up in waves. A submarine, you've got to have it in the right area, and once it has announced its presence, it can't escape very well. Whereas torpedo bombers can fly away. So in the American Navy, there was one dive bomber and one torpedo bomber. They're different airplanes. In the Japanese Navy, they can switch them off. Okay, so and this is important for the Battle of Midway. Any questions about that? So Japan launches its major assault on Pearl Harbor, but it doesn't hit the 4 aircraft carriers. But Japan then goes ahead with its plan. They're in now because they've just started a war with the United States. So the United States declares war, and Germany declares war on the United States as part of the alliance, the Axis. But Japan then launches a whole series of conquests because they basically said, okay, the U.S. is not going to respond right now. The British are busy in Europe. The French and the Dutch are under German control. Let's take what we want. And so the Japanese are very quickly, Pearl Harbor is December of 1941. In early 1942, they take Malaysia from the British. Singapore, which was a British colony, falls in February of 1942, and 130,000 British soldiers surrender to the Japanese there. In January of 1942, they attack the Philippines and take the Philippines, capturing several thousand American soldiers. They invade Burma in January of 1942, which is Myanmar today. And they're pushing into India. They actually want to take India. The entire British colony of India is a target.
Dang, they are trying to get a lot of land.
They are ambitious. The Japanese were supported by Thailand. Thailand sort of said, okay, we'll support the Japanese on this.
Okay.
But in Burma, the British, with support of Indian troops under British control, as well as Chinese troops, as well as American troops, stop the Japanese advance into Burma, and then they drag it out long enough that the rainy season begins, and you go absolutely nowhere in the rainy season because the mud is, knee deep at least.
Can't get tanks or anything through that.
Yes. Any questions about that? So the first half of 1942, Japan just grabs everything they want in Southeast Asia. They also grab Dutch Indonesia. They're just grabbing everything. Any questions about that?
Were they taking like a lot of those tiny islands in the Pacific, like
They would. They would.
as they
Yes.
just come across them?
These are all different island groups, and they're all under. Some are actually under German control. They don't take those, but French, British, American islands. Yeah, they're grabbing anything they can get, basically. And again, their assumption was that if you grab all these islands, if the Americans don't have air support, it's really hard to take those islands. Because on a lot of these islands, you can build an airfield, and the island has its own air support because you've got airplanes on an airfield. Without an aircraft carrier, you can't bring air support in, and so American troops trying to attack islands without air support would just be decimated by Japanese airplanes coming, raining bombs down on them if they're trying to land on the beaches. That would be an absolute disaster. So you need to have air support to cover the ground troops when you're doing assaulting an island, etc. So the Japanese start digging in on all of these islands. They start building bunkers, they start building airfields, they get ready for an eventual American assault. The first major engagement between the Japanese and the Americans was in May of 1942 at the so-called Battle of the Coral Sea, which is just off of the Philippines there. The Japanese had a much bigger military force in the Battle of the Coral Sea. The United States had 2 aircraft carriers in the Coral Sea battle, as well as battleships, etc. The U.S. Lexington and the U.S. Yorktown were the 2 American carriers that were there. The Japanese managed to sink the Lexington. So one of the 4 American aircraft carriers is now gone. They also severely damaged the Yorktown. The Japanese think they have sunk the Yorktown because it's so damaged they don't think it can make it back to port, but it does make it back to port. So it makes it back to Hawaii and is getting fixed by the time we get to the next battle.
How many aircraft carriers does Japan have?
They had 4 that I know of. I don't know if they had any other ones, but I definitely know they have 4.
Did America have 4 total or just 4 in the Pacific?
Just in the Pacific, they have a. So the Japanese think they've sunk. They know they didn't sink the aircraft carriers at Pearl Harbor because their pilots said we didn't see the aircraft carriers. And they know the U.S. has 4 in the Pacific, so they now think they've sunk 2. They've sunk the Lexington, they think they've sunk the Yorktown. But Japan's big next target in May is the island of Midway, which is right here. Midway is roughly, more or less, if you squint a lot, half midway between San Francisco and Tokyo.
Creative.
Is that what it's called, Midway?
I don't know. Midway is important for a couple of reasons. One is it's a coral atoll, so it's just a little lump of coral, just barely 5 feet above sea level. It's a couple square miles, but it's big enough for an airstrip. And this is important because Japan really wants, the last thing they want to take is Pearl Harbor because and Hawaii, because if they can take Hawaii, there's no other major archipelagos before California, and so the U.S. would be starting a couple thousand miles farther east to try to conquer Japan. So the farther they can push their perimeter towards the United States, the safer they feel, because the farther the United States is going to have to fight to push them back. So they really want Hawaii. And Midway is at the western end of the Hawaii chain. And if they can take Midway Island, that will provide an airfield for them bombing Hawaii with ease, because they can just keep launching airplanes from the island. And so taking Midway is preliminary for taking all of Hawaii. Any questions? So the big battle in the Pacific is the Battle of Midway, which happens in June 1942. So the Japanese send a major naval flotilla with 4 aircraft carriers toward Midway to take it. The 4 aircraft carriers, you don't need to know this, but the Akagi, the Kaga, the Soryu, and the Hiryu. I mention that only because I'll mention their names. Now, the Japanese make one major mistake going into this. They're worried that the Americans will recognize what's going on, see how big this flotilla is, realize it's heading for Midway, and be ready for them. Now, they think the Americans only have 2 aircraft carriers, so they're pretty sure that in any engagement they're going to have an advantage because they have 4 aircraft carriers, the Americans only have 2. But the Americans have retrofitted Yorktown. Yorktown made it back to Hawaii, and then in an amazing 2 or 3 weeks, they managed to refit it well enough that it could function as an aircraft carrier again. So they had to rebuild elevators, and they had to patch the decking, and et cetera. It still has a whole lot of work that's left to be done, but it's functional now as an aircraft carrier. So the Americans actually have 3, the Japanese have 4. But because the Japanese are worried that the Americans will find out about the target, the Japanese admiral, Yamamoto, makes a horrible mistake. He decides to break his fleet up into smaller groups and spread it out over the whole Pacific so that it's not obvious that there's a major battle group going towards Midway. So that if one group gets noticed by the Americans won't realize it's a major invasion. But this is a problem because when the battle actually starts, the Japanese are kind of spread out and they have a hard time. Their battleships and et cetera are not in a good position to help the aircraft carriers, et cetera. They're too spread out.